What is up, party people? We are back again today with another biology video, and today we're looking at ecology. Go ahead and pause for our objectives and let's get into it. So ecology is the study of living things and their interactions within their environments. There are different levels of ecological study. There's the organism level, which is focused on an individual organism, and it includes the study of their morphology, physiology, and behavior. You can also look at populations as a whole, which is focused on how all members of the species in a particular area interact with each other and their environment. And that is also the definition of a population, all members of a species in a particular area. And then you can look at a community, which is focused on how members of different species interact with each other in their environments. And this is especially the relationships formed between different populations. You can look at entire ecosystems, which is looking at all of the previous levels together and then including all biotic and abiotic factors in a specific area to see how they influence the individual, population, and community. Then we go to biomes, which are focused on large-scale adaptations to characteristics that impact environmental conditions. And then the largest you can look at is going to be the biosphere, and this is all ecosystems on Earth. And the studies are focused on global influences. So you're not very specific in the biosphere. You're looking at a very large scale. So moving on to biogeography, and this is the study of the geography distribution of living things and the abiotic factors that impact their distribution. So an endemic species are usually found only in a specific geographic area. So like one mountain range, a lake, an island. And this is usually because they have very specific adaptations to a specific area, or they don't have the ability to leave that area. An example would be the Galapagos tortoise. It is only found on one island in the world, and that is within the Galapagos. And well, that's because it's a tortoise. It cannot swim, and there is no way for it to reproduce on another island or in another location because it physically cannot get there. And then as well, geographic location can have a significant influence on the abiotic factors that impact the species distribution. So what are biotic and abiotic factors? Well, biotic factors are the living components of an environment that shape the environment through their activities, and those activities are consumption, production, competition, predation, movement, and they impact other biotic factors and they influence how they're used, movement, availability of abiotic factors. So think biology, bio, living. Abiotic or antibiotic factors are the non-living factors of an environment. So these are things like temperature, rainfall, sunlight, soil properties, nutrient availability, wind, landscape, availability and access to water. All of these are abiotic things. They're not living. They impact living things, but what we just discussed in itself are not living. Biomes. We discussed these a little bit earlier, but what is a biome? Well, a biome is a large, distinct geographical region that is defined by climate. Typically, when we're talking about climate, we're looking at temperature and precipitation levels, soil type, and the unique communities of plants and animals that inhabit the area. So organisms will have similar adaptations across the different biome types, and this is primarily, again, driven by temperature and water availability, so precipitation, and it is influencing the vegetation that is there. And then again, biomes typically include many different smaller ecosystems within them, and so many plants and animals. There is a high level of biodiversity that we typically see. And speaking of biodiversity, tropical wet rainforests or tropical rainforests have the highest level of biodiversity out of any biome that we look at. And so these are found in our equatorial region, so along the equator. The plants have broad leaves and they will fall and regrow throughout the year. They are year-round plants, so they're growing year-round, and it's also enclosed in a canopy, the canopy being the uppermost layer of branches and leaves. Temperatures, they range from, for our Fahrenheit people, 68 to 93, and then precipitation, roughly 50 to 200 inches. And this can vary from month to month, but it has the most rainfall, most biodiversity, and again, that's because of the water availability and the nutrients from that. Next are savannas, which we're kind of looking at almost the opposite here. These are found in Africa, South America, and northern Australia. So these are grasslands with scattered trees, and plants are adapted to fires, and grasses, they'll dry out easily, so catching fire is a natural process. And sometimes we think of wildfires as a negative thing, but in savannas specifically, they are a beneficial thing because there are a lot of plants that will not reproduce or drop seeds until the temperature is that hot, being from a wildfire, because the fire will burn, nutrients will be available, and then things will regrow. And again, it's common in these areas. This is part of that environment. So animal behaviors are also adapted to the heat and dry seasons. They will migrate to water holes. They typically will hunt in the morning or evening to avoid that heat of the day. And then they also will graze, and predators will prey on grazing animals. Temperatures are normally 75 to roughly 84, and rain anywhere from 3.9 to 15.7 inches. And this is not during dry season. Dry seasons are periods with no or extremely little rain. Next are our subtropical deserts. These are found between 15 and 30 degrees north and south latitude, and they're centered on the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. Very few plants that are adapted to these areas, typically only succulents. We think mostly of cacti. There's very poor soil conditions, mostly because of the lack of water. Not many things are dying for them to be absorbed, so soil is very poor, which then means it can't really sustain plant life. There's very little animal life as well because the heat gets so high, and the animals that do live there are adapted to the high heat. So they burrow, they have large ears to cool off their bodies, and then they're typically small as well. Temperatures during the day are anywhere around or less than slightly above 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And then at night, they can drop as low as 32 degrees Fahrenheit, which for our Fahrenheit friends, that is a freezing level. And then precipitation, annually maximum of a foot. And that's within 12 months. So there is hardly any rain in these areas. And then next is our chaparral areas or shrub forests. These are found in California around the Mediterranean Sea, southern coast of Australia. These plants are primarily shrubs. Again, they're adapted to fires. Wildfires are common in the hot, dry summers. And there's a wide variety of animals that inhabit these biomes. Temperature ranges 86 to 104 Fahrenheit, winter 50 to 64 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like early spring for us here in Virginia. And then precipitation levels, they can really get anywhere from 25.6 to 29.5 inches, and most of this rain is falling during the winter. And then our temperate grasslands. These are found throughout northern America, central northern America, so prairies, South America, and Eurasia. And these are mostly grasses. There can be trees, but mostly larger shrubs are also there, and typically along waterways because they want access to water. They have very distinct growing seasons for those reasons. There's a large variety of grazing animals because all of the plants there are grazing plants. It's very dense because of the rich soils in this environment. And then temperatures are roughly 70 to 90 degrees during the summer, and then negative 40 to negative 32 in the winter, which is freezing. Oh my goodness, it's so cold. And then there's also precipitation, which they get anywhere, and this is a very broad range, but anywhere from 9.8 inches to 29.5 inches. So it really depends on that period and time of year. Moving on to our temperate forest or deciduous forest biome. So in Virginia, we are primarily in a deciduous forest biome, and they are found in mid-latitude regions, so most common in eastern North America, Western Europe, Eastern Asia, Chile, New Zealand. They're dominated by deciduous trees, meaning that these are trees that will shed their leaves in the winter. And then they also have very distinct growing seasons, so spring, summer, fall. So if I were to say, describe what those seasons look like to me, I would say winter is very cold, bare trees, snow. During the spring is when things start to bloom again. It's very fresh and green. There's more rain. During the summer, it is hot. Things are a lot drier. There are more heat storms. And then in fall, I would say this is the period where leaves are falling. There's more color to the leaves because they are shedding their leaves and things are starting to get colder. So those are very distinct seasons. And then because of this, they also have a wide variety of animals because they have high biodiversities. It is not anywhere near as large as a tropical rainforest, but it is still a large amount of biodiversity. And then they also typically get a good amount of rain, so 29.5 to 59 inches. Again, this is really going to depend on the season. We're going to get more rain in the springtime because of those specific seasonal changes, and that is our period of growth. So if you've ever heard the saying, April showers bring May flowers, that's because we get a lot of rain in our earlier spring months. And then moving on to our boreal forest, or also known as the taiga. So this is found in the Arctic Circle across Canada, Alaska, Russia, Northern Europe. And it's dominated by coniferous plants. So these are cone producing. They have thin, long, waxy needles, so like evergreens. Animals are adapted, of course, for these cold environments. So they're going to have light colored fur to match in with the snow and extra fat layers to keep themselves warm. They're going to have cold, dry winters, and then very short, cool, but wet summers. Temperatures are going to be anywhere from 50 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit in summer, all the way to negative 65 to negative 30 in the winter. Precipitation, we're looking mostly at 15.7 to 39 inches, and this is mostly in the form of snow. Moving to the Arctic tundra, this is going to be in the north of the subarctic boreal forest and throughout Arctic regions in the northern hemisphere. This is our biome with the lowest biodiversity. And one is because of permafrost, which is a portion of soil that is permanently frozen, meaning plants cannot penetrate that layer. Therefore, larger plants like trees cannot grow. So you're typically going to have plants that are very close to the ground, like a moss or a very short grass. Every once in a while, you might have a shrub pop up, but it will not last long. Animals, of course, are adapted to this cold environment. So again, light colored fur, extra layers of fat. Growing seasons are very limited, roughly 10 to 12 weeks in a period. And then there's also times during the year where it's full day, 24 hours of daylight. And then temperature ranges during the summer, this is ironic, 37 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit, which for us here in Virginia, that is cold. And then in winter, it gets to about -30. And then precipitation, typically in the form, again, of snow, they get maybe 6 to 10 inches, and there's very low evaporation rates because we consider these cold deserts, and that's because it is cold year-round, so it's staying there, it's staying frozen, which then goes back to that permafrost. And then for our marine biome, so again, marine is salt water. And so this is where we see our oceans. This is our largest marine biome, and it's a continuous body of salt water that is uniform in its chemical composition. And there are different zones that are defined by the amount of light that penetrates the water, and each is characterized by very distinct organisms. So in the intertidal zone, this is closest to the land. It's the area between the low and high tide, and there's a variety of species due to the changes in exposure to air and water. So organisms need to be adapted to resist drying out. And they also need to do well in salt water because, again, high tide will come up and they will be covered in salt water, but then low tide will go out and they will be exposed to the air. So some animals will burrow, some animals are perfectly fine. It all depends on their adaptations. Next is going to be our neritic zone. This is from the intertidal zone to roughly 200 meters or 650 feet deep, and it's at the edge of the continental shelf, the underwater landmass that extends from the continent, essentially. And then below that, we have our benthic zone, and this is the part that extends along the ocean's bottom from the shoreline to the deepest part of the ocean floor. So this is considered deep water. It's very cold. There's very poor nutrient levels in the water, and the bottom is very silty, and that's because there are a lot of dead organisms. And there's also a large variety of bottom-dwelling feeders and scavengers because of the dead organisms at the bottom. Next is going to be our pelagic zone, and this is the ocean's open water. So we can actually break this into two zones. We have the photic zone, which is the portion where light can penetrate. So this is roughly 650 feet. And then our aphotic zone, meaning that light does not penetrate, and this is greater than that 650 feet. And then below that is our abyssal zone, and this is the deepest portion of the ocean. It's greater than 400 meters deep, and it has very high pressure, very high oxygen, low nutrients, low temperatures, and no light. And this is also where we're going to see our chemoautotrophs because, again, they have no light. So we'll find them along the hydrothermal vents. We can also think of this as extremophiles because they live in these extreme environments of no light, high oxygen, low nutrients, and the hydrothermal vents. And then coral reefs. Coral reefs are, in my opinion, kind of like the water version of the terrestrial rainforest. So they're ocean ridges that are formed by marine invertebrates. So essentially coral, the reef growth is actually a result of newer generations that grow on top of the previous generations that are calcified and carbonate skeletons. So essentially coral are dead calcified organisms, and then it grows because invertebrates then grow on top of them and become calcified. And they grow in warm, shallow waters of the photic zone. Very high biodiversity. More than 4,000 species of fish inhabit coral reefs that we know of. And the primary coral reef that we think of when we talk about these is the Great Barrier Reef because it's the largest and most well-known, and it's located off the coast of Australia. And then next we have estuaries. Estuaries are found where freshwater meets saltwater, which then turns into brackish water, meaning it's a mix of both. And these are very protected areas because there are numerous species that begin their life cycles in these areas. So mollusks, fish, crustaceans, and many bird species nest in estuaries because of this biodiversity where they can then go and feed and help their young as they're raising them. And then again, similar to the intertidal zone, the plants need to be adapted to saltwater in certain conditions because, yes, there is freshwater, but saltwater is also there. And as we know, with osmosis, if someone is not adapted to salt, that is going to be very detrimental to their status. In fact, it kills most plants if they're in a salty environment. But thankfully, these plants are adapted to that. And we actually call these halophates, which means the plant is adapted to saltwater environments. And then the tides also constantly change. So it ebbs and flows. The salinity of the water is going to change as well because of this. But again, organisms are adapted to these changes. They will have behavioral changes as well as physiological changes to be able to sustain life. And then freshwater biomes. So again, these are the opposite. These are not saltwater. So lakes and ponds, they are found all over the world within various biomes, and they're large fixed bodies of water that are surrounded by land. And the difference actually between a lake and a pond, because there are many ponds that are even bigger than lakes, is the portion of light. So a pond, even though ponds are typically thought of as smaller bodies of water, there can be ponds that are larger than lakes, and that's because light can actually reach the bottom, whereas lakes have aphotic zones, meaning light does not reach the bottom. So that's how we differentiate from a pond or a lake, is whether or not light can reach the bottom. But again, these bodies of water can vary greatly in size, depth, and that has significant variations in where light can penetrate, the temperature of the water, and chemical composition of the water. And then again, light availability is also impacted by depth and the landscape of the lake or pond. And then this is also going to determine what types of plants are able to sustain life in these areas. And then next are our rivers and streams. So again, these are found all over the world within various biomes, but they are continuously moving bodies of water. They are continuously moving bodies of water. I really want to emphasize that. They vary, again, greatly in size, length, width, depths. Even along like its own path, we constantly see changing pathways from erosion. This is how we know whether or not a river or a stream is old. So think about the Amazon rivers. Those are very, very curved in nature, and that's because they're older. So as water flows, it's going to erode and then expand into that new space. And then the channel is the width of the waterway. And then the source of water, which a lot of people wonder, what is the source of all this water? Well, it is the beginning point of a river or stream that typically comes from a spring, a glacier, and from the water runoff from those. They're cold, clear, and low in nutrients. The species vary based on the depth and temperature, as well as light availability, and the rate of water flow. There are some species that simply cannot handle a very abrupt water flow per se, but we know that salmon can. In fact, they swim up water to then lay their eggs, and they are adapted for those environments. Moving on to our wetlands, again, found all over the world, but these are environments where the soil is saturated with water, permanently or periodically. It differs, but they're shallow bodies of water that are very slow moving or even stagnant, meaning they don't move. They're very poor in oxygen, but they have large amounts of decomposed materials, and they also have a low pH. So there's low productivity, but again, these plants are going to be adapted for the lower nutrient availability. And then we also see this with emergent vegetation, which means the plants are rooted in the soil with portions that extend out of the water. And that's what we're seeing here with these mangrove trees. Next is Virginia. So what is my biome? Well, Virginia is considered a temperate forest biome, deciduous, even though there are parts of Virginia that you could categorize as something else, the Tidewater Coastal Plain region, seeing as majority of Virginia, almost everywhere in Virginia to my knowledge, the fact that we have 4 distinct seasons, our trees will lose their leaves, that causes us to fall under the deciduous forest biome, and as well as our rainfall, humidity. Again, we have coastal plains, the Piedmont, Blue Ridge Mountain regions, but because of those characteristics, overall, Virginia is considered a temperate forest. So let's talk about populations and ecology. So a population is all the members of a specific species in a defined area, which then leads us to demographics. And this is the data relating to populations or groups within a population, and it's how we study them. Population size is the total number of individuals in a population. Population density is the number of individuals of a population in a specific area or volume. And both population size and density can have significant impacts on how species live and reproduce. So this leads us to species distribution. So this is the special relationship between the individuals of a population at a given time. And we have 3 different ways. So one is going to be uniform, meaning that they are evenly distributed. And these individuals are spread out evenly with relatively even space in between each other. And we see this in territorial species like birds or certain predators. Random is where individuals are spread out and really no discernible pattern, and we'll see these in plants that rely on the wind or animals to disperse their seeds. There's really no way to control which way the wind or an animal might take a seed, therefore it's random. We don't really have a pattern. And then lastly is going to be clump. These are where individuals form in groups. So we see this with migrating animals or pack-like animals like wolves, for instance. And then age structure. So this is, age structure is the portion of individuals within a population that are within a specific age range. And it reflects the growth rate, which results from the birth rate and death rate variations. And then the overall age structure can also indicate the health of a population. Is it growing? Is it declining? Is it stagnant? Which often is a direct reflection of the surrounding environment. So leading to our next topic, survivorship curves, talking about the death and birth rates of populations. It's a graph that can represent the number of individuals surviving at each age interval versus time, which helps us compare the life histories of different species, and it's based on the portions of a population when they die and during their typical lifespan. So we have type 1, which is where most die later in life, so we see a declining number at the end of the graph, but then they have a large number of individuals that survive early and middle years, so we're going to have a high line at that top middle portion of the graph, and these are humans. An example would be humans. So again, low number of births, mostly single or sometimes at times 2 offspring, and there's a high level of parental care. And then next is going to be our type 2, and this is where individuals die relatively equally all throughout their lifespan. There are a few offspring, but significant parental care as well, so this is like birds. And then type 3 is going to be where most individuals die early on, but the ones who do survive live for a long time. And parental care, which in plants at least, we consider it to be how long the seed is germinating for, how long does that seed stay with the parental plant. And this is our lowest type of parental care in a sense, because once the seed is ready to be planted, the wind will take it, or whichever way that organism plants its seeds. So reproductive patterns. First, we're looking at an individual's potential reproductive capacity, the total number of offspring an individual could produce over its lifetime under ideal conditions. And this is inversely related to the level of parental care, but it is directly related to the timing of reproduction. So early, you have a high chance of reproduction, but at the expense of health or longevity. Later in life, you have greater potential parental care, but there's a high risk of mortality prior to reproducing. So we have two different types of organisms. We have similarity, which is where individuals will reproduce only once in their life and then they will die. So this is like sockeye salmon or annual plants. Once they have reproduced, they are done. And then we have heteroparity, which is where individuals will reproduce multiple times throughout their lifetime. They will not die like sockeye salmon. They could potentially die from childbirth, but they do not specifically die off because of reproducing once. And then growth rates. Growth rates are the number of individuals that are added in each successive generation. So zero growth means the birth and death rates are in equilibrium. Exponential growth, there is rapid growth that results from unlimited resources. So this is not realistic because we're not including carrying capacity or limiting factors. But we're going to see this with a J-shaped curve, which is the shape of the graph resulting from the exponential growth. And then carrying capacity, K, which I just mentioned, is the maximum population and environment can sustain based on the limitations of its resources, which results in a logistic growth curve or an S-shaped growth curve. And this is where we're going to see a population grow and grow and grow until it hits that carrying capacity. And then realistically, it's actually going to go above that carrying capacity before it dips down and will even out again. And then population dynamics. So there are many factors that impact a population's growth rate and survivability. Vital resources are available in limited quantities, which results from competition. Food, water, shelter, mates, competition. So we have two types. We have intra-specific competition, which is competition between individuals within the same population, and then inter-specific competition, which is between members of different populations. So, but they require the same resources like food, water, or shelter. And then resource availability. So this falls under two primary categories. We're going to have density dependent factors, meaning these are factors that influence a population's rate of growth and mortality at a given time based on the population's density. These are mostly biotic, so predation, competition, food, waste, accumulation, and disease. And there's a higher density, which results in higher mortality rates and slower population growth. And then next, we're going to have density independent factors. These are factors that influence a population's rate of growth and mortality at a given time, no matter the population's density. So these are mostly abiotic, weather, natural disasters, pollution. And then classical population biology. There are limited resources and competition for those resources, which then leads us to classify species into K-selected or R-selected species. So K-selected species are the result of stable and predictable environments. Their populations tend to stay near the carrying capacity. They reproduce few offspring, but they have a long gestational period, and they have large immature offspring at birth. And then they have a high level of parental care. So in plants, again, this would be the time where the seed is developing prior to separating. And then in humans, we see this in humans, primates, elephants, plants like trees. Our selected species are going to be the result of unstable and unpredictable environments. So they're going to have a large number of offspring, which are relatively mature at birth, but then we can also see that they might die off quite quicker. So we'll see this in frogs, trout, crabs, oysters, and they lay more offspring to try and continue that population because they know that not all of their offspring are going to survive. Again, because their environments are unstable and unpredictable. And then an ecological community. Well, an ecological community is made of the populations of different species that interact with each other. And then competition for shared resources is the primary interaction, which is found within a community, so interspecific competition. And then we have competitive exclusion principle. Well, these are where two species cannot inhabit the same ecological niche. And that's because interspecific competition will lead to the elimination of one population when they both occupy the same niche. And it can result in a change of niches too, by one or more species. An example of this would be the need for light in succession. Typically, we're going to see the smaller plants like shrubs and grasses. They need light just as much as the trees do, but when they both inhabit the same niche and the trees grow larger than the shrubs and they build a canopy blocking the light from reaching the lower plants, well, now the trees have eliminated the shrubs and grasses from that area because light is not penetrating in the amount that those plants need, so they will die off, leaving only the trees. And then we have different types of organisms. So we have herbivore, which is the consumption of plants for food by animals. We have predation, which is the consumption of an animal for food by other animals. And then a predator-prey relationship, which is the populations of both populations fluctuate because of the predation. So predator populations are going to grow when their prey is high because of high food availability, but then the prey population will decline from being eaten. And then we'll see the predator population decline because there's lower food. And then the prey population will grow because there's less predators preying on them. And then there's a recovery period before the cycle repeats again. And then defenses against predation and herbivory. One, we have mechanical. These can be physical features that prevent or discourage consumption. So like a hard shell in a turtle or thorns on a rose. We also have chemical, which is the use of chemical compounds to prevent or discourage consumption. So this may cause pain, damage, death, or just a bad taste. And some plants and animals are actually toxic. So foxglove, mushrooms, some insects, frogs, and even some fish like lionfish or a stonefish. Coloration is also a big one. It's the use of color to deter a predator. So we have two different types. We have camouflage, which is colorations or marking that allow an individual to blend in with the background. So essentially hiding from that predator because they can't be seen. So background matching is where coloration is similar to the environment, so like deer or a grasshopper. And then active is the ability to change coloration to match the background, so like chameleons. And then we have aposematic coloration, which is a warning coloration. So it's telling predators, hey, I am toxic, or I don't taste good, so don't eat me. So this would be poison dart frogs or monarch butterflies. And then, of course, we're going to have mimicry. This is where one species looks incredibly similar to another to avoid predation. Because if a bird, for instance, knows that a certain butterfly, like a monarch, is not good for them, if they see something else that looks like a monarch, they're not going to prey on it because they already know what happens when they eat monarchs. So we have different types. We have betazen mimicry, which is where harmless species has the coloring patterns similar to that of a harmful species. So flies and moths can look like wasps. And then we also have snakes. So you might have heard the saying, if red touches black, it's a friend of Jack. If red touches yellow, it will kill a fellow. So that's the way to differentiate from a coral snake and a king snake. One is harmless and the other is deadly. So hopefully you'll remember that one if you ever come across a red, black, white, or yellow snake. And then we also have Müllerian mimicry, which is where two or more species actually share similar warning or coloring patterns, which then again increases predator avoidance. So these are like wasps, bees, and butterflies. And then finally we have aggressive mimicry. This is where a dangerous predator mimics a harmless species or an object. So an example of this would actually be an alligator snapping turtle, because their tongue looks kind of like a worm. So what they'll do is in the murky depths of a pond or a lake, wherever they're inhabiting, they'll leave their mouth open and kind of wiggle their tongue or just let it hang out. And then fish are going to think, oh, that's a worm. And then it'll go for that worm. And then the alligator snapping turtle will end up eating it because it fell for its trap. Another example could be an anglerfish using a light to attract prey and then eating the prey. So what about relationships between organisms? Well, we have different types of relationships. We have symbiosis, which is a close interaction between two different species over a long period of time. Commensalism is one species benefits and the other isn't harmed, but it also doesn't gain anything. So this would be birds nesting in trees, birds on cattle. Mutualism is where both species are going to benefit from the relationship. So like lichens, their photosynthetic bacteria or algae will provide food for the fungi. And then the fungi will also provide shelter, or clownfish and sea anemones. And then last, we're going to have parasitism, which is where one species will extremely benefit while the other is harmed. And we see this in ticks, for example. And then a key component of health of a community is biodiversity. It's the community's biological complexity, and it's measured by the number of different species, so species richness and their evenness, so relative species abundance in a particular area. And we look at a lot of different types of species. So we have that foundational species, which I mentioned earlier, and it's typically the primary producer, which serves as the foundation for the community. It provides the bulk of available energy. In Virginia, our deciduous forest, these are oak trees. And then a keystone species is going to be the species whose presence is vital to maintaining that biodiversity within a community. So our example for that was wolves within Yellowstone. And then succession, I've mentioned this a few times, but what is succession? Well, it's the appearance and disappearance of a key species in a community over time resulting from a disturbance. So, well, we start with a catalyst, an environmental disturbance. So we have two types. We have primary and secondary succession, but they all start with something traumatic: a volcano eruption, an earthquake, a fire, a storm. You can also have a human disturbance like farming, logging, building a home. And again, primary or secondary, and it's based on the source of the disturbance. The more egregious the disturbance, it's going to be primary. If it's not as egregious, it's going to be secondary. So an example of primary would be a volcano eruption. An example of secondary would be a wildfire. In primary succession, there's no previous community. You are simply left with bare land. And then weathering is going to allow for these surfaces to be colonized by plants and lichens. They're going to have no soil at first, and then over time, with our pioneering species, which are the first organisms to establish the newly formed area, are going to form that soil. And then our intermediate species will move in, and they will establish as the soil increases. So these are going to be our grasses and shrubs. And then the climax community over time will also occur, which is where organisms reach a state of equilibrium. So you're back to normal, essentially. Here is a diagram of that. And then secondary succession is where portions of the previous community actually remain, so from logging or a fire. So there is soil. You're probably going to have grasses, maybe some shrubs. So the pioneering stage is going to be relatively quick, so annual plants are going to appear first, grasses, weeds, and then intermediates are going to come in, like perennials, wood plants, larger shrubs, fast-growing trees. And then climax community is slowly going to grow because trees will replace the fast-growing trees, and then eventually it will reach equilibrium. So something to note as well is primary succession takes hundreds of years, greater sometimes even than 1,000 years, whereas secondary is typically anywhere from 50 to 150 years. So it's very, very different. And then here's an example of secondary succession. And then we have officially reached the end of this presentation. So I hope you learned something new from this video. Feel free to drop any questions or comments you have in the comment section below. Make sure to check out the other videos.